I want to talk about my new Substack post. It's out now. It's entitled, Will Science Do a Better Job Post-COVID-19? I'm going to put a link to it down below, and I'll show it right here on the screen. But before I talk about will science do better post-COVID-19, I got to talk about something that appeared in the news today. Dr. Paul Offit. Paul Offit is a proponent of vaccination. He is, in fact, the director of the Vaccine Education Center at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. There are no greater proponents for vaccination than Dr. Paul Offit. And here's what it reports in The Atlantic. It says, Dr. Offit, quote, told me that getting boosted would not be worth the risk for the average healthy 17-year-old boy, end quote. Quote, Offit advised his own son, who was in his 20s, not to get a third dose, end quote. Even with Omicron's ability to sidestep some of the protection vaccines provide, Offit says he believes that his son is well protected against serious illness with 2 shots, and a third just isn't necessary. That is a staggering quote by a guy who has devoted his life, his career, towards the promotion of safe and effective vaccines. This gentleman is on record as saying that he doesn't think his own son should get a booster. That really should raise serious alarm bells across the community. We've had 2 officials in the FDA drug products resign. We've had the director and the deputy director. Now you have Paul Offit, a man whose credentials for vaccination cannot be questioned. He invented a vaccine himself. He literally invented a vaccine himself. He's written books about people who are great vaccinators. And this gentleman is saying the risk-benefit profile at this age for boys is question mark. And I've written about that in my Substack. I've been saying that since June in pieces in MedPage Today, etc., and pieces in Stat on my website, etc. Paul Offit is good to say this, and I think it reflects a broader conversation that needs to be had about how many shots is optimal, why is the UK and the US different, what is the best strategy going forward, what is the risk-benefit profile, not of shot 1. I think that, to me, is less debatable. Shots 2 and shots 3, particularly for men between certain ages who have never had COVID-19. I think that's the question mark. And it is important to have that debate because we want to vaccinate people as safely as possible. We don't want to promote things that are unsafe. And if you do that out of expediency, out of putting forth some White House plan, in the hope that you will have some short-term gain in curbing cases, I suspect you will pay a deep, long-term price if you make any error. And I think that the administration really needs to ask themselves, what the heck are you doing? You've got 2 people, senior people at FDA vaccine products resign. You got Paul Offit going against you in the popular press. You need to reconsider your strategy. I think it's already been a boondoggle, and it's only going to get worse if they double down on it. Back to science. So the topic of my post was really about will science do better? And I'm afraid that I had some sobering news, which was that science wasn't doing that great before. Venkmurthy, a colleague of mine at University of Michigan, a cardiologist, he said that, and he clarified his remarks to me on the phone recently, he said that, science has definitely not done well with SARS-CoV-2, and I wrote a piece that basically argued, well, it wasn't doing that well before. There are a lot of problems in science, and then he called me to say that, his point wasn't that that isn't true. He actually agrees that these problems are true, and they've been there for quite some while. He said that, people, the average person, wasn't as aware of those problems, and now their trust, the average person's trust in the quote-unquote science, or the quote-unquote expert, has diminished greatly, and it will continue to erode post-COVID-19. I worry about that. I also think COVID-19 has done something that may have existed in some pockets of science before, where there was a pairing of science and politics, where some issues in science were universally with one political party or the other. But COVID-19 has amplified that and made it much, much worse, so that masking young kids and the data around that, or boosters, or, a host of number of issues, lockdown, shelter in place, these sorts of things, are, for better or worse, wedded to political parties. And so when science goes back and tries to assess whether or not, quote-unquote, lockdowns worked or were worth it, and by worked, I mean, did they slow the spread of the virus, and were worth it, were they offset by greater harms in the short or long term, I think it will be very difficult for science to disambiguate that, and you might even get 2 different literatures, a literature supportive of it with certain political cheerleaders, and a literature that shows the exact opposite conclusion with different political cheerleaders. And that, to me, would be a worst-case scenario, but it appears that's already happening out of our hands. I would never have thought that particular pills would have become polarized, but they did. I would never have thought that one political party would favor a medication without good data, and the other political party would favor a non-pharmaceutical intervention for years on end without good data. But that's really what's happened. So in this piece, I wanted to explore science, I think, more broadly, and to talk about it a little bit. What really is science? Science is often presented, I think, in schools as if it was a collection of facts about the world. We learn about astronomy and the body, etc. But science, when you actually do it and do it for a lot of time and a lot of years, and you publish a few hundred papers, as in my case, you'll see it's very different. It's not a set of facts. It's a way of thinking about the world, and it's a way of reducing uncertainty on issues where there is uncertainty. So, for instance, you want to answer something, you try to think about it in a rigorous, impartial way. You approach issues ideally without preconceived notions. Even if you've heard one thing or the other, you don't bring that baggage to the issue. First, I think you have to survey the literature very broadly, see what's out there, see what people think, and see what evidence supports what people think. Next, I think you need to think about what are the holes in the existing evidence. And then you think about what experiments, what could you do, either experimentally or even observationally, to reduce the uncertainty in those spaces? What can you contribute? How can you help clarify between different hypotheses that try to explain the same observable facts? And that's what science is. It is a method, largely experimental. Experimental science, I think, is the gold standard when it comes to causal claims about what makes us better or worse, what helps societies. The more you can experiment prospectively, the better off you are. Then you introduce problems. How do you experiment? And of course, when it comes to human beings and medicine, randomization is a great tool. It's a great tool. Why? Because when you randomly create two groups of people, the outcome of interest that you're looking at, whatever that outcome is, should have a similar distribution in those two groups of people. If you were to do nothing, if you just were to have an inert intervention, have a similar distribution. Now you start to do something, you can look to see, is the distribution of outcomes different? And that can't be due to a difference in the types of people. It's got to be due to what you're doing because you randomly put them in those groups in the first place. And that's very different than non-randomized studies. Whatever the non-randomized studies, people who chose to do, you insert the thing, people who chose to eat a healthy diet or wear a mask or whatever, they had whatever better outcome. You need to separate the doing that thing from the type of person who would have done that. And that's a very tricky business. It's often not able to be done with existing data sets because you don't know all the other characteristics of the person that might have affected that choice. And when it comes in medicine, there's a classic problem, which is confounding by indication, which is that the doctor is picking and choosing who to deploy therapies in based on the sort of eyeball test. Does this look like the kind of person who can tolerate this or do well from this? And that leads to, I think, many, many flawed observational studies in biomedicine. And you don't have to believe me. There are broad empirical analyses of this. Most recently, I think Rahul Banerjee and I wrote the editorial in a JAMA Network Open paper of a comparison of observational and randomized control trials on the same clinical questions in oncology, which found massive discordance. Many times, the results went in different ways. And they tended to have a certain type of bias, which was that observational evidence tended to suggest that more things worked, and they worked well. And then randomized evidence was sobering. It was more the dunking in cold water. Fewer things worked. When observational studies were negative, randomized trials more often confirmed that. And you can read our editorial. What's my point here? My point here is that science has always been a method of knowing, a method of adjudicating uncertainty. If you have a strong preconceived notion, if you are a true believer, it's very difficult for you to do it. You will read the literature, I think, with your own preconceived notions, and then you won't be able to conduct the studies you need to conduct. Throughout this pandemic, we've seen over and over true believers say, well, you can't study the thing that I think helps. Why? Because the thing that I think helps is a parachute. It would be wrong to deprive some group of people access to this thing I think helps. But the truth is that the thing you think helps usually doesn't help that much. It has a modest to marginal effect. And the only way to separate your hope and your wishful thinking from the true effect is randomization. So you really ought to randomize. And this cuts both ways. There are elements of that, I think, on both political sides. However, it has surprised me a little bit more from one side than the other because one side tends to be enriched in the academy. And so I was surprised to see so many people who I consider to be smart people accept on face value things that are hitherto bold propositions. For instance, when the American Academy of Pediatrics went beyond the World Health Organization, and the World Health Organization says don't mask kids under 6, and they said we're going to do it for 2, I would think more people would say, what's the evidence for this? Or could we run such a study to reduce the uncertainty? But they didn't. They didn't say that, and that's what surprised me about this. The more I reflected about COVID-19, I thought that, one of the deficiencies, I think, was a failure to conduct better studies. Another deficiency was a very unique way in which we demonized people. And I point out John Ioannidis. Pre-pandemic, there's nobody who is more, I think, heralded in science than John. 1,000 publications under his belt. The man is accruing citations at a pace that will soon put him, I suspect, as the most cited scientist in human history. He's been routinely vindicated on topics that people were surprised. For instance, if you go back and look 1 year before the Wall Street Journal expose on Theranos, you'll find John's paper in JAMA on Theranos, and he was question mark about Theranos. He, of course, was greatly vindicated. Years before anyone else started to worry about reproducibility, you'll find John's paper, Why Most Published Research is False, talking about these issues, talking about the core issues in the reproducibility crisis. John has distinguished himself in that way time and time again of being one step ahead of his peers. And then when it comes to COVID-19, where this guy's immediate reaction, and I think informed by his appraisal of the evidence at the time, was that I think the bottom line conclusion he felt was captured in a stat piece on March 17th, 2020, which was that we should worry that, like the elephant scared of the mouse, we fall off a cliff trying to evade it. In other words, that even though SARS-CoV-2 I think is a real threat, and I think he felt so at the time as well, that it is possible to have interventions that under some circumstances are worse than the threat you're facing. That's true in any walk of life. And he was just suggesting we might want to think about that. He also said some things that were universally, I think, necessary that nobody ever did, which is we should do a seroprevalence run by the CDC of a group of people randomly picked across this country and repeat that at fixed intervals so we actually get a sense of how much this pandemic is spreading outside of the quote-unquote documented cases, because seroprevalence captures the true denominator. If we had that, we'd actually be able to know things like, in the United States, how do you compare myocarditis post-vaccine from myocarditis post-infection? The United Kingdom, they have a comparison, and it actually shows under some scenarios that myocarditis post-vaccine was higher. Dose 2, dose 3, Pfizer, dose 1, dose 2, Moderna. I believe there's a prior video on this podcast talking about that UK paper in Nature Medicine. But, and I'm talking about men under 40, but it didn't use a seroprevalence denominator. The Germans, in their paper on kids and their outcomes, they did use a seroprevalence denominator. If we had a seroprevalence denominator, we'd be able to say with a lot greater precision, how serious is this illness? How has it changed over time? What is the IFR? How has that changed over time from first wave to second wave to where we are now with Omicron? We would really be able to say that. Right now, all of the studies I read use some inferior denominator, which is people who've presented or tested positive, which is not the same as people who've had it and didn't go seek testing. So John was absolutely right in his assessment of what evidence needs to be gathered. But the point in my essay that I make is that how did this guy, who is literally one of the best scientists, went from the best scientist to the most demonized scientist within a matter of 4 or 5 weeks? It was astonishing. And now, when people read his work, he's written some umbrella reviews of all of the papers on IFR, infection fatality rate. And in his umbrella review, if you actually read this paper, you will see, his brain is still working well. He's got a number of astute points, but people are not reading the paper. They just anchored on that he bad, others good, ergo anything he say bad. I mean, it's very primitive, and it's not really what I have thought of as science. It's not what I think of the academy. And I've talked a little bit about the masking literature. I think that's a problem. I've talked a little bit about parachutes. I think that's a problem. I think the way in which we treated kids is a particular place in which science, I really think, failed because, we've just continually placed more and more restrictions on children. Just today, I hear Berkeley Unified School District, a place with 90+% vaccine rates, has mandated N95 or equivalents in children in school. And that troubles me in several ways. One, I'm not even sure what it means to have an N95 in those ages, because an N95 is a certain type of validation of a filter. That means it can filter a certain amount of particles. That means somebody had to run some study to see how many particles were filtered. But I'm pretty sure they're not running those studies in 5-year-olds or 6-year-olds in Berkeley playing in a class. These are studies run on adults who are participating and wearing this with a certain grade of fit. And so whether or not this is even, quote unquote, an N95 equivalent as it's worn by children, question mark, question mark, question mark. But also the virtue of a policy that if I, by fiat, set this policy, that will make it better for these kids. Incredibly dubious. To do that, to prove that, you need cluster randomized controlled trials, because it's more than just the mask. It's whether or not they wear it and how much people struggle with, pulling it aside to scratch their nose or trying to drink or taking it off or compliance. I mean, this is all baked into the policy equation. Only a cluster randomized trial can show that. We have no such study, and yet we escalate. In fact, we didn't do the right trials that we needed to for cloth masking kids, and now we're escalating with N95s. Vaccination policy, I think, is a great example. I think this Paul Offit example fits so nicely. Here you have a guy whose credentials on vaccine science, I mean, it cannot be questioned. There's nobody out there who can say Paul Offit, he's got an anti-vax bent in him. The man doesn't have an anti-vax bone in his body, and even he's telling his own son, be cautious with dose 3, and I wouldn't advise it. That's got to give people some pause. I don't know what else it's going to take for people to say, okay, maybe we got this wrong. And by we, I mean there is a group of people who have, I think foolishly, come to conflate that if a little vaccine is good, a lot of vaccine is better. And so we have to give as many boosters as we can to as many people as we can and have as low a regulatory hurdle as possible to do that. EUA, mean geometric antibody titer against benchmark historical control. That's good enough for me. It's good enough for me. And heck, even some of them say, even when the trials fail to meet that modest endpoint, they say, maybe we should prescribe this off-label. I've heard that for the for our early age to 4-year-old study where the mean geometric mean titer was not met by 2 doses, and now Pfizer's adding the 3rd. People are saying maybe we should get ahead of the data here. That to me is really, really bold. Unbelievable, really. I've never seen such a thing, an appetite for risk, an appetite for uncertainty. At an age like that, I just don't know what to say. And so our vaccine policy, I think, has become very, very wedded to party and very absolute and has lost the middle ground, the reasonable, which is that, yeah, we ought to do it insofar as it makes people better. It is a great good, yes. And of course, you have to focus on older people rather than younger people, just because of the way in which this virus exerts its toll. But of course, you need credible data, and the more credible data, the better. And as you slide down the risk gradient, you need even better data. You don't need less data. You need more data, actually. You need a bigger randomized control trial to have some power to find something. You can go back and listen to the interview I did with John, where he called some of these randomized trials so small they're more of a ritual than they are an evidence generation machine. But then I started thinking about pre-COVID, and I really thought hard about pre-COVID, and I realized that a lot of the core failings were there, but they were a little bit different. You see, we did have an appetite for debuting and wide-scale delivery of products that have very little evidence, or strategies very little evidence, but they often were pharmaceutical products where somebody stood to make a lot of money, and the people who turned a blind eye to the evidence generation happened to be being paid by those companies, and that was something that I'd railed about in 2 books, etc. But I also noticed there's another place where when it comes to, there's some places where we just never thought very critically. I think the cancer screening place has been such an example over a quarter century. We've moved from the idea that anyone who didn't pursue sort of wide blanket recommendations for mammography, are mistaken. And there was the old American Cancer Society guideline that said if a woman hadn't had a mammogram, she needs more than her breasts examined. That was literally the ad slogan by the American Cancer Society. That was uninformative fear-mongering, really, fear-mongering pre-COVID. It existed, and it was used to encourage people to participate in mammographic screening. Then, of course, guidelines shifted over time. We went from yearly 40 to 50 to every other year, and it took a lot of time for people to start to appreciate overdiagnosis and competing risks and having a more nuanced conversation about it. And now I think we've actually reached a better place on screening than we were when I started in medicine in 2005. The better place is that we can actually have some dialogue about the pros and cons of screening. It's not an unalloyed good. And yet, that's an example that I think is akin to a lot of the challenges we face in COVID-19. I also thought about the Nelson trial. This is a great study. It's a study of CT screening for lung cancer where the all-cause mortality, and you can read my Substack post, it is literally indistinguishable between these 2 arms. In other words, you got all these people, they were very sick and vulnerable, and you did something to them, and you found a lot of cancer, and you took them to surgery. But at the end of the day, there ain't no more people alive who you did it in than the people you didn't do it in. And so that to me should be sobering, which is that you didn't improve the thing that people come to you to improve, which is how much time do I got, doc? And you still move forward with blanket population recommendations. And that to me is sort of it's very similar to the cognitive biases we see in COVID-19, which is that, boy, human beings are smart, we're clever, we're capable, this ought to work. Even though we don't have robust evidence that it does work, maybe we ought to give it a shot. I talked a little bit about, recent years, we've changed screening guidelines based on modeling rather than randomized control trials. And that is also, I think, reminiscent of COVID, where we're putting greater and greater stock in a type of science that is very malleable. I mean, a model is to some degree, a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's as good as whatever the inputs are that you put into it, and I get to pick the inputs, and I also happen to have a vested interest in what outcome you provide. And so I think models are prone to distortion. The interview with John, I went back and listened again recently, and he made an interesting point that we need some sort of broad standards for modeling, maybe some external validation. Maybe before you run your model, you have to get somebody to sign off on parts of it so we can all agree. So the more I reflected on it, I realized that COVID-19 didn't bring out new things in science that never existed. It merely exacerbated problems that existed in science, wishful thinking that existed in science, lack of evidence generation. It put it on steroids, obviously. There were more people interested in this topic than ever before. We put a lot of people participating in the debates who didn't have biomedical background. And what's the difference? If you're an engineer, you live in a walk of life where so much of your life is manageable if you know the parts to it. They know how the computer works. They know how the phone works. They know how to fix it. But the body is much more complex than that. And human societies and systems are much more complex. And even if you think you know how the parts work, you often need empirical evidence that the policy itself works. And so you had a juxtaposition. You had, particle filter scientists saying masks work, #masks work, and the people who run cluster randomized trials for a living saying, you better run a cluster randomized trial, you want to know that for sure. And then you ran a couple. We ran one in Bangladesh that has a result, and cloth failed, and surgical won, but it was true under a very unique set of circumstances. A population that was rural, that had no pre-existing immunity, that had no vaccination. Does that apply to other ages and populations? And Jean Noble, in a recent interview I did on this podcast, she talks about extrapolation, which is another sort of classic problem in biomedicine that's less so, I think, in other fields. So, you had that. You had the political dimension, and that was a dimension that was more than I'd seen before because, to some degree it was there before because people who were right of center were probably more pro-business and much more likely to embrace novel, costly technology with uncertain evidence to some degree. But people left of center also were the same. It wasn't that different. There wasn't that much of a difference between the political parties and their views on drug and device adoption. And proof of that is that many of the legislations that govern U.S. Food and Drug Administration that progressively lowered the evidentiary bar over the last quarter century were bipartisan legislation that was passed under a Republican president and a Democratic president, and they continually lowered the bar because the lobbyists were just more powerful than the people who would push back on lobbying in the biopharmaceutical space. So that was there, but it wasn't as polarized. I've never seen anything like it. So going forward, it really made me reflect. The root deficiencies, I think, in this space are not collecting data when you should collect data. That's always a failure. The more you collect data, the better. The more you collect data for data purposes. I'm not talking about data that people are given and then they're tempted to act upon it because that can lead to some bad decisions. But I'm talking about population surveillance, the random testing that John called for, that the CDC should have done. That kind of testing was done in the UK to some degree, and it helped them clarify whether or not they want to vaccinate healthy kids. And right now, from 5 to 11, they're holding off on it. Right now, as of this moment, they're holding off on it, in part based because they have zero prevalence data. We don't have that good data, as good data as they do. So collecting more data like that by central agencies, that would have been good. I think the other problem would be the other challenge is running more experiments, realizing that sometimes you just don't know the answer. You don't know the answer. You got to run more cluster randomized trials and reduce the uncertainty. That was something we weren't doing that good before. When they ran, Nelson RCT and NLST, and the answer, I hate to tell you, lung cancer screening proponents, the answer is a mega randomized control trial for lung cancer screening that's powered for all-cause mortality. The answer isn't getting the USPSTF to green light you and get it covered and build your quality metrics. That's not the answer. The answer is a bigger randomized control trial. You didn't call for that. And guess what? We didn't call that for masking. We didn't call for that for therapeutics. If it weren't for the UK recovery investigators bailing us out on therapeutics, we'd be up a creek, so to speak. I don't want to say what kind of creek, but you know what kind of creek we'd be up, because if it weren't for them running that trial, we wouldn't have a lot of good evidence. They were running big randomized controlled trials. Good for them. Thank goodness. These problems have existed. What was different is that it had much more moralizing than I've heard before, but to some degree in cancer screening, I had heard a bit of moralizing. Gil Welsh was a bad guy and Barry Kramer was a bad guy. Those were people who highlighted the harms of overdiagnosis in the past when it was unpopular. But this moralizing was a whole nother degree. And then the political tribalism was a whole nother degree. And I think for me, as somebody who, had always identified as a progressive, why? Because I do believe a society should do more to help the people who are the least fortunate through no fault of their own, but luck of birth, and do more to provide a fair and egalitarian an equal playing field, at least, equalize the opportunity. And we fail in so many ways, from early childhood education to unequal programs in college, et cetera. And a lot of our failure is on the early side of life. That's the real root of failure. And then for me to see progressives who should care about that issue pretty much get on the wrong side of all of the issues around restrictions on children, on schools and closing schools and remote schools, and they still keep getting on the wrong side of these issues. That has been very disappointing, because it is literally promoting policies that sabotage the values you purport to champion. And in fact, not only are they're not just neutral to the values you claim to champion, they are directly contradictory to the values you claim to champion. And you do not see that you may in part be motivated by fear and irrationality. Okay, so this was a long-winded discussion, and I hope I've weaved together all the concepts, but I won't know for sure until I actually go back and listen to what I said. So if I weave together them sensibly. But my general theme and the general point of this broad dialogue is that COVID-19 did represent a failure of science. That's for sure. And people talk about the science TM, and they're right to lampoon it, because it is I think, catastrophic failure. It's a failure of evidence generation. It's a failure of acknowledging uncertainty. It's a failure of policy. It's short-sighted policy. It's a failure of communication. It's a failure of sampling. It's a failure of even keeping track of what we're dealing with. That failure is owned by lots of people, and people who said they were going to help save us and make 2021 better than 2020, they didn't do any such thing. In fact, they might have even bungled it even harder. And because they abandoned these principles, and the principles of science that they abandoned were running randomized control trials, collecting evidence, hearing views of people who disagree with you, thinking about trade-offs and complex policy decisions. But the point I want to make is we had been abandoning that for some time. We weren't perfect with that. We were always doing that. Venkmurthy's point is now the public has seen us with our clothes off. They know what we're all about, and they're going to lose all out of trust in us. And I think he's right. I think he's spot on. And what I worry is that, have we entered some sort of death spiral? Has science literally entered the final death spiral? And what would the death spiral look like? It would look like more and more issues become political. I think climate science was an early political issue. These COVID issues are all political. But where will it stop? Will blood pressure medicines become political? Will cancer drugs become political? Will they have a right-left valence to devices versus drugs? As more and more things become political, and there's no reason why that they'll be spared from the political machine. Politics is a way of creating tribes. It is interesting that there are two groups of political parties that are almost always sort of in dynamic and balanced relatively, because they're constantly changing their platforms a little bit to kind of keep that equal market share. And political parties to some degree exist to perpetuate their own existence. And that's what you see, and they're constantly shifting policy platforms. And they may increasingly incorporate scientific principles and policies into their platforms. And university professors are not immune to these temptations. In other words, what I mean is they're more seduced by their tribal affiliation than the core principles of science. They don't know what they believe. I tweeted something recently about kids protesting in-person school and how I disagreed with that, and I think that they have been misled by the media coverage. And somebody said, you don't think the teens can think for themselves? And I say, look, I think the world of teens, and I'm sure that many do think for themselves, but I want to point out that many quote-unquote experts, blue check marks, they're not thinking for themselves. They're merely going to the central tendency of the herd and following what people they know think. And I think very few people have actually independently appraised every single study on masking before they tell you what they think about masking. I know because we published that 25,000 word, 300 reference article, the working paper on this topic. And I doubt many people read all that because it takes a heck of a long time. And so when you take your cues from people you know and in your social circles and you don't independently appraise the evidence, I think it's very easy that you will start to succumb to tribalism. And also when, you live at a time where all the other tribes that used to unite us are increasingly dissipating and vanishing, and we're left with sort of political tribalism. And so I do worry science will enter the death spiral. The death spiral will be more and more things will become political, and then in the near term, we may even have a schism and we'll have two different bodies of science. I think that would be terrible. How might we go the opposite direction? It will take putting people in charge who have the power to resist the voices of everyone. People who are born in the era of social media where you can just tune out what millions of people tweet at you and say and focus on what you believe. And you need to know what you believe. I was telling someone recently, that I know what I believe on all these issues. I know what I believe, and I know why I believe it, because I believe it, because I did the work to figure out what I wanted to believe. And I don't take my cues from anybody because I don't have any loyalties to anybody. But We need a lot of people to do that. And we also need broad dialogues. The last thing I'm going to close with, a statistician from Harvard who I follow, who I really enjoy, Kareem, he made an interesting point that said one of the things he missed throughout this pandemic was why wasn't there a debate on masking kids and opening schools and vaccinating policies, a debate with panelists from the best universities, primetime debate, or posted on YouTube, a 3-hour debate hosted and moderated by people you know and trust. And I think the answer is because universities have absolutely abdicated their responsibility. It wasn't the job of a random Joe Schmo to hold such a debate. It was the job of Harvard or Stanford or NYU or Columbia, etc., prestigious universities to hold these debate. And I think the reason they don't is that increasingly universities are beholden to their donors. And their donors are playing this tribal political science game. And the more their donors play the tribal political science game, the more they are scared to even house the debate. And somehow we've entered this culture where words are violence and ideas that you disagree with are harmful to you, and it's getting all a bit much. But that's where we are. And when you're in that world, of course, if somebody comes along and has a grand hall debate on should we mask kids, they'll say even having the debate is contributing to someone being harmed. And sometimes both sides will say that, you don't know which side's going to say that in a given issue. But that is very problematic, and we didn't have those debates, and that's another failure and abdication of the role of the academy. And if these institutions, the universities, the major journals, they don't want to hold those debates, then you know what? They're digging their own graves. The institutional reputation and credibility depends on them being able to take ownership of those dialogues. And if they don't, they will not be the institutions they were. They will decay and no one will care what they think. And science will be conducted by podcasts, by people who are willing to have 3-hour dialogues with other people. And that will be the place, that will be the institution that rises. And, as much as I love those dialogues, that's not what I want to see. I want to see these institutions regain their credibility. And I want to see science try to mend itself by admitting uncertainty and by running prospective randomized trials more, because that's what actually settles debates, not rhetoric. Well, on that positive note, long video. On that positive note, you know what to do. This is what you get on this channel. You get these kind of meditations at times, and often you get shorter, more succinct commentary. Put a link to my Substack below. You like this video, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, comment, leave a message, hit that bell. Until next time.